we now enter into the last full panel of the two-day forum, which I think very appropriately is a dialogue with legislators, so with leading members of Parliament in Europe and in the United States, to discuss sort of the broad range of transatlantic defense issues and to see how they sort of play out in the political context. So we have three terrific panelists here. Will Hurd is a representative from Texas at the House of Representatives. He formerly serves in the CIA, and he's played a leading role on technology and other issues and thinking about those over the last 5.5 years during his time in the Congress. He will be joining us by video at the end. He very much wanted to participate in person, but due to a scheduling complication, we now have him in that video at the end. In person and live, we will have Chrissy Houlahan, who is a member of Congress, Democratic member of Congress from Pennsylvania. She's a former officer in the US Air Force and has played a leading role in the Congress since she was elected 2 years ago in thinking and working on defense issues. And Radosław Sikorski, who is formerly a Minister of Defense from Poland and is now an MEP from Poland and is one of the leading voices in Europe on foreign and defense policy. So we thank all three for their time on this panel. So we'd like to, I think, discuss some of the issues came up already, but I'd like to turn to Radek first, if I may, and really to ask you about the role of the EU in the transatlantic relationship. Radek, you, of course, spent time in the United States, worked over here for a while, have a very long history in sort of working with the United States on foreign policy. And I think it's fair to say that one of the issues that maybe is most difficult for Americans to grasp is sort of the nature and role of the EU in foreign policy. Here in the US, Americans are sort of accustomed to thinking about NATO when they're not thinking about sort of bilateral defense relationships and bilateral foreign policy relationships. So my question to you is, you know, how have you seen this evolve over the course of your career? What moment do you think we are in now, particularly given that, you know, from the White House, there's, say, a greater skepticism of the EU, maybe than there has been in the recent past, and having sort of, you know, maybe listened to some of the conversations over the last couple of days, but certainly the broader debate about the need for the EU and the US to work more closely together. How optimistic are you that we can have a really sort of solid and deep sort of cooperative relationship between the EU and the US compatible with NATO going forward?
Hello, everyone. Well, we have pledged ourselves in the Lisbon Treaty to have a common foreign and defense policy, but despite what the High Representative has just said, he is actually not being loyally supported by the member states. On most important issues, ministers agree a policy in Brussels and then pursue their own national policies in parallel to the EU, which makes us less effective. We have also pledged ourselves to do more in the area of defense. But here we have a dilemma. On the eastern flank, Europe is threatened by Russia, and that's a job that Europe, the tearing of which is not a job that the EU can take up. For this, NATO is still essential, and we cannot do without the United States. But I think the United States should be pleased if the EU took care of its southern neighborhood. It was Britain and France who took the lead on Libya with mixed results. But the rest of North Africa is not exactly stable either. And just like you wouldn't count on us to help you in your southern neighborhood, so I think we could bear the burden of leadership by just protecting our southern perimeter more effectively. But for that to happen, the EU's defense policy would have to get serious. And whether or not it is serious, you can gauge precisely by following the money. And here I'm disappointed that the original proposals in our multi-annual budget, 13 billion euros for 7 years, which was not huge to begin with, have been pared down further as a result of the economic downturn following the pandemic. So I'm afraid Europe will not be a player in the defense field for the foreseeable future, which is a pity. We are trying to do some with research projects, maybe some procurement, but only on new systems. I would like the permanent structured cooperation of the EU to be more ambitious, and I'd like to see Europe creating at least a symbolic force that could actually be deployed in an emergency. And I think this can all be done not just in compatibility with NATO. I think given the challenges that the US is facing in the Middle East and in particular in East Asia, I think the US would be relieved if Europe took up its burden in the Balkans and in North Africa. And I hope we can collaborate even more fruitfully on this in the future.
Thank you so much. Representative Houlahan, Chrissy Houlahan, if I could bring you in, and just to ask you a version of the same question, really about the role of the EU in transatlantic defense policy. Over the last few years, maybe the EU has been a little bit of a controversial topic. President Trump, of course, has made it known as sort of skepticism of the European Union, seeing it partially as an economic competitor. On Capitol Hill, there's been very strong support for NATO, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about both how you and how the Congress overall sort of sees the role of the EU in fitting into that transatlantic relationship, and maybe some of your reactions to what we just heard in terms of how the EU has been improving its defense capabilities, and maybe with some challenges still remaining to come in the years ahead.
And I apologize that I just joined you, thank you, a little bit late, and I'm going to switch glasses so I can see you a little bit better. So I wasn't able to hear the entire first question or the original question, but I was able to hear a little bit about the answer. You're right. I think that the United States would welcome more European involvement in terms of its defense and the defense of that larger region. You're right that this last several years of this administration has been difficult for us to be able to navigate through. Our relationship collectively, our historic relationship remains incredibly important. And I hope that the European Union and NATO has seen our commitment remains and is steadfast from a congressional standpoint to the European Union and to NATO as well. But we are in interesting and difficult times where we are increasingly as a nation kind of pulling back, becoming a little bit more isolationist in our expectations and a little bit more demanding of our allies in terms of how they defend themselves and how they defend our collective values. And so I think that my hope is that you're seeing that there is a contradiction of sorts that is coming from the Congress versus from the administration, bipartisanly from the Congress, a real rallying to the cause of NATO and to the cause of the EU. But you're right, I think it's pretty hard to separate out what is a narrative that is about economic competition and the narrative about making sure that we're also still military allies and are working together to secure our common national security interests. And so it's a complex formula that we're all trying to navigate ourselves through.
Thank you. If I could follow up with you just, and then we'll go back to Radek after this. But one of the themes over the last 2 days of discussions in the forum has been China. It's come up in almost every panel. We just had a panel discussion specifically on China and technology, and the High Representative Joseph Borrell from the EU spoke earlier about sort of the era of a more naive Europe having come to an end, and Europe having to develop more hard power. And he proposed this dialogue with the US on China a few weeks ago. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us, do you think that China is an issue, the China challenge is an issue that the EU and the US should be working on in particular? And where do you sort of see that headed maybe over the next few years, or what should be done in respect of it?
Sure, and I'm very fortunate in the Congress that I'm able to serve both on the Armed Services Committee as well as the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that is a fairly unusual purview that a member of Congress is able to have. And I also am fortunate in that I've spent a lot of my career prior to joining Congress thinking and focusing on Asia and China in particular as a businesswoman. And so I come at this with those two, perspectives. One is China in many ways is taking advantage of the United States' increasingly isolationist tendencies and filling the void. And they're filling the void not only in places like Africa and in Asia, but also, frankly, in Europe as well. And so we collectively, I believe, need to be concerned about the rise of China, not just in terms of their economic ability, but also in terms of what their influences are on things like cybersecurity, things like 5G technology, things like ports and building infrastructure and Belt and Road issues. And I do think that we need to be a lot more aggressive collectively together in our collaboration and cooperation to make sure that the rise of China is contained. In my opinion, they are not a good actor. In my opinion, they are a nation that we need to always keep our eyes on. We have a competitive relationship with them, but unlike our European allies, it is not historically one that is a relationship of being allies with them. So I would like to see us working collectively on those issues, and also, as importantly, on the issues of human rights. As we know, China also has a pretty poor track record in the area of human rights and their treatment of populations within their boundaries as well as externally. And so I'd like to see us have a more active role collectively in working through those issues as well. All of that will require a lot more cooperation and international engagement than we've had in the last several years of this administration.
Thank you. Radek, if I could turn it back over to you, and on the topic of China, I mean, there's really been a pretty dramatic shift, it seems, in Europe over the last few years, largely driven by China's behavior, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, certainly up until 2015, Europe sort of had an approach generally, which was premised on the idea that economic engagement with China would lead to more sort of political cooperation. Since sort of the Made in China program for 2030 launched in 2015, there's been a bit of a sea change, and we now see a greater skepticism, more controls, investment controls, sort of a stronger position on trade. And the parliament in some ways has played maybe a leading role in this, in speaking up on the skeptical side when some of the governments have been a bit sort of divided on this. I'm wondering if you could just maybe give us your perspective on how enduring do you think this shift is? How would you characterize it? And if we do see this US-EU dialogue on China, which High Representative Borrell and the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo agreed to recently, do you think that that could get legs? And do you think we may see some real substantive action through it? That's too erratic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, yes. Yeah.
I think we all in the West made a bet in the 1990s that as China gets wealthier, it will liberalize first its economy and then possibly even its politics. And let's be clear, we lost that bet. It was the United States that advocated China's admission into the World Trade Organization and giving it the status of a market economy. And I think some of us now regret it. I think we should work closely on this, and I'm glad that the US administration seems to have worked it out that a two-front war with Europe and China at the same time is a bad idea. I'm glad that we're no longer a foe. But there is a difference of perspective. For us, China is a challenge in many fields. Ideological, it's a communist dictatorship. industrial, commercial, ethical in the way that they research and make things, human rights, of course, cyber, almost all fields except military. Because US allies on the periphery of China are not Europe's allies. And in fact, I think it works the other way. If the United States mishandled its competition with China and got into something worse than a coldish conflict, we would fear that the US would then withdraw its forces from Europe. So we have an interest in helping you to manage your competition with China in an orderly fashion. But I have already fielded amendments in various EU documents calling for the re-establishment of COCOM. This was the coordinating committee that worked very well in the Cold War in monitoring the transfers of technology to the then communist world, except that we should broaden its limit. It shouldn't be just technology, it should also be inward investments, and it should be ethical standards of researching and making things. And we should work with like-minded democracies to monitor minimum standards of doing these things in relations with non-democracies such as China and Russia. And I think we could do it informally without treaties, and we could do it fast and effectively.
It's very interesting. Yeah, the resurrection of COCOM, it gets to this larger question about that came up earlier in the previous panel about decoupling and diversification. Chrissy, I was wondering if we could come back to you on that, and then I want to turn to Russia and disinformation. But you know, the whole sort of crisis of COVID-19 has in some ways awakened politicians in Europe and the United States on this question of interdependence and being overly dependent on China, maybe some other countries for critical supplies. It seems like there is a bit of a bipartisan push for greater resilience on that front. And then some are concerned that there could be unintended economic consequences from that. What we just heard is that Europe may be interested in working with the United States on that as a trusted partner. So it wouldn't be sort of every nation for itself, but we might see more sort of a bloc or an alliance approach. Could you just talk to us a little bit about your perspective on just the lessons maybe of COVID-19 in terms of this interdependence and supply chain, you know, critical supplies argument?
Yeah, so my background is actually in inventory management and supply chain. That's basically what I've done as a professional for all of my adult life until coming to Congress. And so this conversation about our vulnerabilities as a nation and also globally, when something like pandemic exposes what our supply chain actually looks like and how complex and complicated it is something that's really interesting. And then you layer on top of that the issue of supply chain is about life or death situations, whether or not we're able to, as an example, find a vaccine or any sort of treatment for this disease. And then if and when we are able to do that, how we're able to accelerate its production and manufacturing, where we're going to produce and manufacture that vaccine, how we're going to distribute it, and then all of the ancillary supply chain, you know, issues about syringes and about vials and that sort of thing. And that's a conversation that's happening right now. And I'll put aside the conversation that we've all just been through and still go through with PPE and protective equipment. I am leading an effort here in Washington, a bipartisan effort to make sure that we're thinking about global vaccination efforts and that we are being thoughtful global citizens and cooperative with nations that would like to cooperate with us, because it is not just the right thing to do ethically, but it's the right thing to do selfishly for our health if we are working collectively to make sure that we discover a treatment or cure, and that we're distributing it as rapidly as possible and inoculating us collectively as a nation and also as a globe. And so I do have some hope that I think at least in the Congress have the appetite for that conversation. I do hope that our administration also has that similar conversation. What the pandemic has exposed to us is just how interdependent we all are. You know, I live in the state of Pennsylvania. The state of Delaware is having issues. The state of New Jersey is having issues. Those are my neighbors. I'm sitting here about an hour and a half from my home right now in Washington, D.C. What we do in Pennsylvania affects what happens in Delaware and happens in New Jersey. What we do in the United States, of course, affects what happens in Europe and in Asia and in the world at large. And so I am hopeful that we have the opportunity to work collectively together, similarly to the conversation we just had on the issue of the pandemic. I do recognize that there are genuinely real human and economic impacts to things like the fact that right now travel is restricted, not just from here to the EU, but also frankly from here to Delaware in my case, or from here to Pennsylvania. So it's a collective national and international challenge that we have to engage and cooperate and to make sure that we are engaging our leaders and demanding of our leaders, both here domestically in the US and globally as well, to be cooperative and part of the solution.
Thank you. We have a question from one of the audience, and Radek, this question is for you, and it's from Erwin Lagadak, who asks, he said, in November 2011, you made a famous speech in Berlin calling for a greater German role in asserting European strategic interests and security capabilities. He asked, how would you now characterize where Germany was then and where it is now?
Well, I would still repeat those words, that I fear German inactivity more than I fear German power, because we need Germany's active participation in saving the Eurozone and saving the European economy. And that's slowly happening. There's a impending compromise between Germany and the South. There will be some common debt, but with a ceiling. But we also need Germany to move on the big geostrategic issues. You know, Russian missiles in the Kaliningrad Oblast can now reach Berlin with their nuclear warheads. That seems to be an elite topic of conversation in Germany, but the general population doesn't seem to be interested. Germany is lucky in that it is surrounded by friendly states. But I think it's a little unfair that flank countries bear the burden of defending ultimately also Germany. And here I think President Trump is right. European countries should spend the recommended 2% of GDP on defense, and Germany is nowhere near that. We need another grand bargain between Germany and France on Europe becoming more strategic, of at least being able to protect its own perimeter, because either mass migration or great instability on our borders can, through the political process, can destroy our confederation. It's all very complicated because we are a confederation like you were before the Constitution. And there were reasons why you moved to the Constitution, because it didn't work very well. And it's, of course, particularly difficult in foreign and defense policy.
Thank you. You mentioned Russia. So, Chrissy, I'd like to come back to you on Russia. We hear from some sources in Europe, President Macron, for instance, famously last year, calling for not quite a reset with Vladimir Putin, but maybe more cooperation, or sort of, turning the page on maybe the relationship of the last few years. But we also hear in the United States, of course, of this looming imminent threat from Russia interfering in this year's election. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about how you see the threat from Russia at the moment, and how worried are you by what could happen in the next few months, and what's the scope for sort of European-US cooperation on that sort of disinformation and interference challenge?
So I worry about Russia in the same ways that I worry about China. I'm of that age where when I served in our military, I'm an Air Force veteran. It was at the very tail end of the Cold War, right before the Berlin Wall fell. And so I hold and harbor that, kind of perception of Russia from that time. And I think 25, 30 years later, we're here again, where we need to recognize, in my opinion, that Russia is not a friendly actor, particularly when it comes to issues like you're talking about destabilizing democracies like ours, creating chaos and confusion in countries like ours, and in countries in the UK, in the EU, as well as across the globe. And so I think one of the things I wanted to add on to the most recent comment is that bipartisanly, Congress has been continuously committed to making sure that we remain a part of NATO, that we actually put in the teeth of the NDAA that we passed last year, a requirement that any money that would ever be used to try to get us out of NATO would not be appropriated by the Congress, to protect that relationship that provides what we were talking about in terms of protection of the region, the European region. We also, this NDAA provided requirements and strings to making sure that our troops weren't moved by our administration out of Germany without a signature statement that says that this won't cause damage or harm to NATO. And that's a pretty big bar to jump over. That happened again bipartisanly, both sides, House and Senate, during the NDAA process, that has not yet become law. When you ask about kind of our concerns about Russia and election security, I'm very concerned, as are many of my colleagues. Unfortunately, right now, in the 1.5 years of this session of Congress, we have not successfully passed any legislation that protects our nation from influences like Russia or China on our elections, cyber interference or of any form. And that really is unfortunate and really, really worrisome. A group of classmates of mine, I'm a new member of Congress, have put together a bipartisan task force for exactly this purpose, to say we need to drop the politics here, we need to drop the partisanship here, we need to understand and recognize that the sanctity of our vote and our access to the ballot is paramount. And we've collectively, as a freshman class, introduced a variety of different legislation that would hopefully stop some of the progress that Russia and others have been making in sowing discord in our nation and in other nations. And so, as an example, some of the legislation that I've put forward has made it illegal for foreign money to come through citizens, normal citizens. It is currently a standard, but it is not law that is the case. And so it seems very, very simple that you ought to be able to legislate that if somebody from the European Union, as an example, handed me $10,000, I shouldn't be able to send that $10,000 to a representative or a candidate of my choice. And so those are some of the basic things that, unfortunately, as a nation, we haven't had the appetite to legislate for. I'm not certain if you guys in your area have had the same resistance to that, but for whatever reason, not dissimilar to COVID, this has become a political conversation when it should not be. There should be no politics involved with whether or not we should protect the access to the ballot and the sanctity of our vote. There should be no politics involved with whether or not we should be wearing masks and combating this disease.
Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left because we want to fit in the conversation with Will Hurd as well. But Radek, if I could give you the last word on this topic, and if you just want to maybe say a word or two, just if there is a transatlantic divide between the EU and the US on Russia this year or looking ahead to next year.
Look, I worked very hard to achieve a Polish-Russian reconciliation. We got President Putin to visit Gdańsk on the anniversary of the Second World War. President Putin was actually the first leader of Russia who visited the Katyn forest massacre site. We lifted the arms, the trade embargo. Things were moving, and up to a point, Russia was interested in an association agreement with the EU. But we just cannot tolerate Russia grabbing the territory of its former colonies and neighbors. changing borders by force on the pretext of coming to the assistance of your national minority on the other side has a terrible connotation and history in Europe. We have learned to resolve such issues by dissolving borders and not by changing them. And so, yes, we should have a dialogue with Russia, but Russia needs to move too. It needs to withdraw its forces and support for separatists in Ukraine. And without that, we would be giving President Putin a victory that he doesn't deserve.
Thank you, Radosław Sikorski and Chrissy Houlahan. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for your leadership in the EU Parliament and in the Congress. We really appreciate it, and we hope to have you back next year for the next iteration of the EU Defence Forum. I'd like to turn now to our conversation with Will Hurd. Will and I spoke yesterday. As I mentioned earlier, he is a member of Congress in Texas, previously served in the CIA, and has really been a leading voice in Congress on these issues. And I started out by asking him roughly the same question I asked of our two panelists on the EU and its role in sort of the US-European relationship, pointing out that it's often sort of misunderstood or maybe has a less prominent role than NATO, and that some are sort of suspicious of it. And I asked him to sort of tell us a little bit about how he thought about the role of the EU in the transatlantic alliance and where he saw some room for cooperation in the future. So let's please go to the video now. Thank you.
I definitely don't think it's a competition. I think it's complementary to the efforts of NATO, and NATO has a very specific mission. NATO was created 70 years ago in order to deal with the threat of Russia, and I think we have to continue doing that. But many of the issues that we're dealing with today, especially in the security realm, are much broader than just Russia, and that's why the opportunity to engage with the EU and individual nations at the same time is important. I think it's hard for a lot of Americans, it's also hard for many of my colleagues to wrap their head around an organization. We have a difficult enough time dealing with a system that only has two parties, let alone dozens of states, dozens of parties. And so I think it's complicated, and that's why we don't understand it, because we don't have anything like that here in the U.S. But I think the steps that have been taken by a number of the EU ambassadors to the United States in educating members on the role of the EU, what the EU is, and how it can play a role in these major generational defining challenges that we're facing is good, and we got to continue to increase those ties and connections.
Thank you. So over the last few years, China has emerged as obviously an overarching sort of challenge and issue for the United States, but also for Europe. And European countries individually and collectively through the EU have sort of asked the United States to work together on China. Famously, President Trump was sort of dismissive and said the EU was sort of worse than China in some respects. He was talking mainly on the economic side. But a few weeks ago, Joseph Borrell, the High Representative, proposed a special strategic dialogue with the US on China. And Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, then subsequently agreed to engage in that dialogue. Do you think sort of China is an important sort of piece of that transatlantic discussion? And how do you think that dialogue and partnership will play out? What are some of the points of tension, and what are the points maybe of possible cooperation? And where would you like to see the most progress be made on transatlantic policy toward Beijing?
So the simple answer is yes. A U.S.-EU cooperation towards and on China is important. But before I delve into that question, let me step back to when I first came into Congress. When I first came into Congress, most of my interactions dealing with the EU were around privacy. This was the beginnings of the debates on GDPR, the General Data Privacy Right Act. And this was some concern about, was this a protectionist stance by European countries against American companies? And that was kind of defining the non-security cooperation relationship, transatlantic relationship. Now, I forget how many years we've been under GDPR now, a year and a half maybe. What we've all learned is we all go to a lot of websites that have cookies. And so what's interesting is I actually believe there is not that much daylight between the United States and EU when it comes to privacy and what is privacy. The EU and America is closer together on this issue than EU and China. The Chinese don't care about civil liberties. The Chinese don't care about private property or privacy. And so one of the areas that is going to define our future wars is on technology, and artificial intelligence is one of those. And one of the key elements of artificial intelligence is obviously data. And so we have to kind of put to bed this debate around privacy, because unless the United States and the EU start working together and cooperating, we're not going to be able to keep up with the Chinese when it comes to AI. And what do I mean by that? The amounts of data that's required to train algorithms and the amount of computing power that is required to take the data and the algorithms and put this all together to have true AI is going to require cooperation. And an authoritarian government like China can move all levers of government in one direction. And so if we start working together, if we start pooling resources, this is a way that we can define the ethics around artificial intelligence in a transatlantic, liberal-leaning, Western value system, rather than authoritarian system of China. And that is going to be absolutely critical. When you look at issues of quantum computing, the level of cooperation we should be having and sharing research amongst our allies is important. Now, I believe we should be strengthening our alliances, not weakening them. And this is one area why we have to work together in order to deal with China and accept the fact that way more unites us in this transatlantic partnership around this issue of privacy than it does between China and the rest of Europe.
Thank you. So just to follow on from that, over the last 12 months, there's been a fairly sort of contentious transatlantic discussion on 5G and the role of Huawei in European sort of technology infrastructure on a country-by-country basis. Now, from Washington, there's been a very strong sort of bipartisan stance urging sort of caution and that Huawei be excluded largely from those networks. And it seems like there has been some movement on that in recent months. But one thing you regularly hear from Europeans and in the United States as well is that we don't really have an alternative, or maybe that we sort of missed the boat in trying to prepare sort of a viable alternative to Huawei, since Huawei is largely sort of state-sponsored and has that power of Beijing behind it. What lessons do you draw from that? And do you sort of maybe share the view of some of your colleagues in the Republican Party that the time has come on these key areas of strategic significance to rethink the role of government? And is there a role for both the US government and then European and American governments to be more active in the technology space?
So I do believe we can be more active in the technology space. We should have national strategies on what kind of basic research that governments historically have done that has led to revolutionary technology, and making sure that that's in line, making sure that research that is being publicly funded is available for all to use in order to supercharge the innovation process. And if we were able to get that right as a country, and the individual countries of the EU can do that, and then EU together, and then we work together, the resources that we would have would be fantastic. I will always take entrepreneurship and free markets over authoritarianism any day of the week. Now, authoritarianism may get you to a point first, but creativity and entrepreneurship will always win. And should we, the alternative to Huawei. Huawei has 30% of the world's market in 5G. Now, a lot of that is because they dominate in China, obviously. And the question becomes, can you protect the data that's flowing over potentially compromised infrastructure? Some believe yes, but as things are moving as technology innovation is happening in technology. I don't know if we can always say that's the case over time. So how do we create a competition? Because saying Huawei is dangerous and owned by the Chinese and a security threat is not enough. There has to be the alternative, Tom, as you said in your remarks. So how do our governments work together to incentivize competition, incentivize? In the U.S., we passed a tax reform 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the things we did was that if you do capital investments, you can write those off in year one. Can you extend that for entities that are involved in 5G, right? And you can take a broad perspective of what 5G actually means. Can governments be doing 10-year contracts with providers for these types of things in order to incentivize and to help make sure that there's an alternative to Huawei? Those are where the conversation should be happening. And the only way that we're going to catch up, and I do believe that the West is behind when it comes to the 5G race, is by working together. And when we talk about research, what is the next thing, right? I don't know what 6G or 7G looks like. What can we ultimately leapfrog? And we have examples. I lived in the Philippines for a while when I was at university, and nobody had home phones, right? But the cell phone infrastructure in the Philippines in the 90s was unbelievable, and because they leapfrog over it. So is there a way to do that as well? And we got to be working together on how to do this against this broader threat.
Thank you. And one just final question, just to briefly to wrap up. You've obviously got an intelligence background. Intelligence is a key part of defense policy. The UK obviously has left the European Union. That was a key sort of player in that space. How important do you see intelligence cooperation between the United States and the EU, with regard to sort of Russia, terrorism, this broader array of challenges? And is there anything that needs to be done in the near term to sort of solidify intelligence cooperation post Brexit?
I absolutely. I am as you said, a professional intelligence officer by training. What intelligence allows you to do is focus limited resources in the most efficient way possible. And one of the areas that can be helpful is leveraging the folks that are involved in all these new technologies and new areas to understand what their assumptions are. Let's take the issue of cybersecurity. Most American and European banks have the best idea of where the next Russian malware is going to come from. So why aren't we taking those assumptions and turning those into intelligence collection priorities and going out and collecting information based on that assumption, and then get that information back in the hands of people to protect themselves? And so the public sector and the private sector is going to have to work together in order to defend our digital infrastructure and defend our systems from our adversaries. And that starts with intelligence. Now, what does that look like? Because I think intelligence sharing and cooperation is really driven on a bilateral relationship rather than a multilateral relationship, probably outside of NATO. And so how do we put those systems in place? And what is, how do we make sure that the core competencies of European nations are being utilized to the most effective means, and what we're able to bring to the table? And so I think I have more questions than answers, but this is something that is going to ultimately help us to make sure that, because we all have limited resources, and where can we best focus those?
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time for this important conversation. Thank you for your leadership on these issues in Congress, and we're very excited to see what you do next. So please keep in touch, and we look forward to having you back to Brookings Defence and hopefully to future EU defence forums in the coming years.
I appreciate the invite, and I'm going to take you up on it. This is an important a relationship that needs to be strengthened over time. And I'm looking forward to being able to travel again and get out there and see folks on the ground. So Tom, I appreciate you having me.